Hello. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Great. So you can hear me and see me, I guess, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. All right. So let's start our class. Uh, Let me start my presentation.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Okay.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right. So now I'm going to start the class. And those who have unmuted their microphones, could you please mute it? All right. So, asking once more, am I audible to everyone?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So let's start, huh? So this is, the fourth novel in our MEG3 classes. Uh, MEG3, which is British novel, and the fourth novel is Great Expectations. So I'm sure you must have already heard of the book. You must be knowing who the author is, and all of these details you must already be knowing. So let me start with my presentation. Okay, can you see this slide that I have displayed?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right. So the first topic that we're going to be talking about is the author as literary entrepreneur. Some features about Dickens' working life. So that's a picture of Dickens that you see on the right side of the screen. And let's start with his own life. Okay, how did he live? What were the conditions under which he grew up? So Charles Dickens, he was born on February 7th, 1812, and his father, John Dickens, managed his money so badly that he was often on the verge of bankruptcy. Bankruptcy means like going completely broke, no money at all. So in 1823, he was imprisoned at Marshalsea Prison for debt. So his father went into prison for debt for being unable to pay back money that he had borrowed from others. And so young Charles, a young boy, Charles, a young boy aged around 11 years, he was forced to drop out of school and work in a blackening factory. So this was something that, this is child labor, right? A boy of 11 having to work in a factory under very severe conditions. So this forced child labor. He had no choice because he suddenly had to grow up and take care of his siblings and the rest of his family. So this experience of forced labor had a deep effect on Dickens as a novelist. And he wrote about, the themes that you find recurring in his novels. The problem of poverty, social insecurity are the topics that you see coming up again and again in his novels, especially in his early novels. Now, by the age of 18, he was working as a journalist. He became known for his comic, satiric, realistic sketches of London life that he contributed to the monthly magazine. So that was a time when magazines were very popular in London, and by the time he was 18 years old, he had tried to move up in life, and he had started working as a journalist, writing out realistic accounts of life in London, in the city of London. And he was well known for his comic presentations, his satiric presentations, and his realistic sketches of what it meant to be a citizen living in London at that time. So when Chapman and Hall decided to publish monthly sporting sketches, Dickens was asked to write for them. So these two publishers, Chapman and Hall, when they wanted to publish something like what was happening in the city in that particular month, like sporting sketches they called it, and Dickens was asked to become a writer for these two people. And That's how Pickwick Papers came up. Okay, Pickwick Papers made Boss. Boss was a pseudonym that Dickens had adopted. So when he was writing, he was known by the name as Boss, writing for these monthly magazines. Pickwick Papers made Boss into a household name. So everybody would buy these papers and read it, and the name of this writer became very well known by that time. Its success transformed the print market itself for the emergence of the serialized novel. So, the success of these monthly magazines, uh, the periodicals that started appearing, it was something that we can say paved the way for the emergence of the serialized novel. The novel, written in forms of a series, parts of which would appear in each installment of the magazine as it came out. So he was uh, someone who really had a really difficult childhood, but at the same time tried to bring himself up from that situation and move forward in life. Dickens' abilities as a novelist was inseparable from the print market. Okay, so he wrote to sell his works. Okay, so it was something which was very connected with the saleability of what he was writing. Now, even after the success of Pickwick Papers, he kept a close watch over the sales of his work. A Christmas Carol was written in 1843. Now, many of you might have already studied Christmas Carol, I think, the experience of Christmas, the ghost of Christmas past and Christmas present coming, and kind of bringing a change in the heart of the selfish central character. So this book, Christmas Carol, which was written in 1843, the form, tone, and timing of these books were aimed at the increased demand for literary entertainment during the festive season. So those were times that people bought books during festive seasons. This was their form of entertainment, and Dickens did not hesitate to write books that would cater to the spirit of the festival, to the festive spirit of that season. So that is how Christmas Carol came to be written in 1843. And some of the other books that he has written, he was pretty prolific actually. He brought out quite a number of books. See, A Dombey and Son was written between 1846 and 48. David Copperfield was written between 49 and 50. And Bleak House written in 52, 53. Hard Times written in 1854. After that came Little Dorrit, 55, 57 period. And Great Expectations came after all of these books, written during the period 1860 to 61. And after that, in 64, 65 came Our Mutual Friend. So altogether, he was the author of 50 novels, but one of those novels was incomplete. And he, apart from writing novels, he also wrote a lot of short stories and essays and articles and novellas. Novellas are shorter than novels. His public readings of scenes from his fictions became a rage, and he took to extensive touring, first in England and then all over the world. So he crossed seas. He loved reading excerpts from his own books, and the public also started loving it. And so he traveled almost like authors nowadays do these book tours, something like that. He did this reading tour all around England, and then he traveled to other countries, including America. The Great Expectations appeared serially in All the Year Round between 1860 and 61. So this also appeared, the book that we're going to study, it appeared serially between 60 and 61. Concerned with the idea of self-improvement embodied in Dickens' own life. So basically, we can say that it tackles with this idea of self-improvement that Dickens himself had lived through, like from being a child laborer working in a blackening factory to becoming a journalist, and what he did to reach that. So he had undergone this period of self improvement. So we can say that Great Expectations deals with this idea of self improvement, which was part and parcel of Dickens' own life. In Great Expectations, the whole business of upward social mobility becomes a complicated and gloomy process. So, um, this is, upward social mobility. I hope you understand what that means, right? Rising up from a given social level to a higher level. Social mobility, rising up from a lower level to a higher uh, level in terms of where we stand in society. So this the whole business of social mobility was nothing that happens in a linear fashion, or something that happens, from stage to stage, to from a lower level to a higher level. It had its own complications. It had its own gloomy undertones to it, which is what you find Great Expectations trying to portray. So this ideal of self improvement, which was very popular at that point, at that time in England, it is not something that happens in such a simplistic manner. That is what you find when you study and when you analyze Great Expectations. So moving on to the next slide. So in this page, in this slide, I'll just give you like a very short summary, and then we'll go into the details in the coming slides. Okay. Now, on the right side of the screen, you can see some of the important characters in the novel. The little boy on the extreme right is Pip, who is the main character in this novel, and another important character in the novel is Miss Havisham, okay, who kind of has a big influence over the way in which Pip grows up. Now, let's look into the short summary. Okay? Great Expectations follow the childhood and young adult years of Pip, a blacksmith's apprentice in a country village. So, Pip is a central character, and he is working as a blacksmith's apprentice in a country village. And we are going to be talking about how he grows up from childhood to the adult years of Pip. He suddenly comes into a large fortune that is part of his great expectations. So, from a poor blacksmith apprentice, he suddenly becomes a young man with a lot of money. He inherits a lot of money, and what he does and how does it change him? So, he suddenly comes into large fortune from a mysterious benefactor and moves to London, where he enters high society. He thinks he knows where the money has come from, but he turns out to be sadly mistaken. The story also follows Pip's dealings with Estella, a young woman he adores but who cannot return his love. Estella is adopted daughter of Miss Havisham, that old lady that you see in the picture. That is Miss Havisham. And Estella is the adopted daughter of that lady. So Pip falls in love with Estella, and he loves her completely, but she is a young girl who cannot return his love. In fact, delights in killing the love of any young man who falls for her actually. And now coming to the social and historical context. So the mid 19th century, this was a time of great social change in Britain. There was increasing movement from countryside to the towns, and education was slowly improving. Legal system was being changed, and all of these changes find reflections in the novel. Now, I'm going into more details. So this is again, the key details as far as the plot is concerned, and we start with young Pip. Okay, so young Pip meets and assists escaped convict Magwitch on the marshes near his home, where he lives with his sister and Joe Gargery, the village blacksmith. So the first scene in this novel starts with Pip suddenly being accosted, suddenly being met by this escaped convict. He goes to the cemetery, and there he meets Magwitch, who is an escaped convict. And Magwitch forces him to bring uh, blacksmith's tools to cut the chains that he has on his body. So the little boy gets very scared actually. So that is the first scene. So where Pip meets Magwitch, the escaped convict. And we are introduced to Pip in that scene. And we understand that he's a young orphaned boy who's living with his sister and her husband, Joe Gargery, who's the village blacksmith. And the second step, you see Pip going to Satis house. Satis house is the big manor, big house, the Lord's house in that village, you can say. Pip goes to Satter's house where he meets eccentric Miss Havisham and her adopted daughter Estella. He returns on several occasions. So he goes to Satter's house many times, and Satter's house is where Miss Havisham lives, and that is where he meets Estella. Miss Havisham, the first time Pip sees Miss Havisham, he gets thoroughly, overawed by her. She's dressed in a gown which happened to be, her wedding gown. There is an air of decay and, everything falling apart in that house. And when he sees Estella, she is very beautiful, and he falls in love with her very fast. And he tries to go there again and again just to be, just to meet her. Then, after working as a blacksmith's apprentice for a number of years, Pip grows up and is one day informed that he has come into a great deal of money. He assumes that this has come from Miss Havisham. So, Miss Havisham seems to understand his admiration for Estella. And Pip continues to go there all through his childhood years. And as soon as like he's growing up, and when he becomes a young man, he suddenly hears that he has come into a lot of money. He has come into an inheritance, and he assumes that the inheritance or the money that he suddenly got from an unknown benefactor. He doesn't know who has given him the money. So he assumes that it must be from Miss Havisham, who wants to give him money so that he can improve his situation, go to London, live the life of a gentleman, and become worthy of marrying Estella. This is what he thinks, but it's not the right thing. He assumes that his benefactor might have been Miss Havisham. Then Pip travels to London, where he tries to become a gentleman. He grows increasingly fond of Estella, but neglects to maintain contact with his family. So when he comes into money, he goes to London and he wants to forget the kind of life that he had led in the village, and especially he tries to forget, or kind of blur out of memory the relationship that he had with Joe, his brother-in-law. His sister dies by that time, and Joe, he was pretty close with Joe. The relationship that he had with Joe was almost like father and son. But when he gets money and he goes to the city and he tries to start living like a gentleman, he does not want to retain any of the relationships that he had with anyone in the village. So he tries to forget all of these past relationships. Then, uh, and he's becoming increasingly closer with Estella in London. Now, at that point, he learns that Magwitch illegally returns from abroad and announces that he is Pip's secret benefactor. So he comes back. Magwitch is disappeared from the scene. After that first scene, we don't see him. But then, when Pip is already in London and trying to live the life of a gentleman, he comes to hear that Magwitch, the escaped convict, is back in London, and he also comes to hear that it was Magwitch who was his secret benefactor, the one who had given him all this money. So that was something that shakes the very foundation of Pip's existence. Whatever he had believed, he had thought that Miss Havisham might have been his benefactress, but everything changes when he realizes that Magwitch, the convict, was the one who had financed him, who had given him all this money. So Estella plans to marry, and Estella, she does not want to marry Pip, although Pip is really in love with her. And Estella is planning to marry Bentley Drummle, and Miss Havisham is involved in a terrible fire. So Miss Havisham, when he goes back to the village, meets her. She becomes sick. He goes to meet her, and after he goes away, she gets involved in a bad fire and gets badly wounded. After Pip unsuccessfully tries to get Magwitch out of the country, Magwitch dies in prison, and Pip loses his fortune. So, uh, all that he had believed to be part and parcel of his life, like he the inheritance that he got, which he thinks that Miss Havisham might have given him, that is proved wrong. And he, in fact, discovers to his horror that it was his ex-convict who was part and parcel of the inheritance that he received. So everything is changed. His whole life is totally turned upside down. And at first, he does not want to have anything to do with Magwitch, but later he wants to help Magwitch from being caught by the police. He tries to get Magwitch out of the country, but police catch him, and Magwitch dies in prison, and Pip loses all his fortune. And he goes back to the village. Okay? Now he's older and he's wiser, and he realizes what are the relationships that really mean something. He goes back to his village and he meets Estella once. By that time, she's already married to Bentley, but that relationship doesn't work out. And yet, it's not mentioned in the book that he marries Estella. Okay, that Pitt marries Estella, but he does go back and meet Estella. So this is the way in which the story moves, and if you see the left side, you can see a pictorial depiction. Uh, just you can see the first part here. Can you see my pointer? So Pip meets Magwitch. That's the first scene. Okay, and then later on, how the important part in the story is his relationship with Satis house and the people living in Satis house. That is Miss Havisham and Estella. And then, as time passes, he comes into a lot of money. He receives a lot of money and inheritance, and he doesn't know who has given that to him. And then, using that money, he goes to London thinking that he would become a gentleman, which was something that people at that time aspired to be. And then he hears about how Magwitch, the convict, had returned from abroad, and he also understands that it was Magwitch who had actually given him all that money. And then later on, the next important part is how Miss Havisham gets burnt. Okay, you can see she's wearing white gown like a bride's gown. She was when she was a young lady, she had fallen in love with this man called Compison, and they were about to get married. But Compison was a criminal, was a crook, who just manages to take advantage of Miss Havisham and leaves her at the altar, does not keep his promise to marry her. And from that point onwards, Miss Havisham became bitter and revengeful towards all men. And that is why, although she tries to bring up Estella, she wants to, wants her to hate men, and her revenge, that Miss Havisham's hatred towards all men, is is actually executed through Estella. She teaches Estella to be totally unkind and unmerciful, and to really kill love in the hearts of young men. This is what Miss Havisham does. So she gets burned and passes away. And Magwitch, by the time Pip has learned in London that he is, in fact, he has benefited from Magwitch's money. So he tries to help Magwitch and tries to help him to escape from clutches of the police, but that plan fails and he dies. And then Pip returns home and to Esther. So this is, in short, the key plot details of this novel that we're going to look at. Going to the next one. You can see young Pip standing there in front of Satis house. So this is a still from the film. You can see that, big mansion and this boy standing in. Now let's look at the relationships, okay, with of Pip with all of these important characters in the novel. Now Pip is a central character in the novel. He's a narrator of the story, which is about his life. Okay? And we have, see, Herbert Pocket is best friends with Pip, one of his closest friends. Okay? So Pip's kind and loyal friend who's related to Miss Havisham. Now, the other important character is Miss Havisham herself. She's a strange, reclusive woman who was swindled by her fiance on her wedding day. So she was cheated by her fiance on her wedding day, and that makes her very bitter and revengeful towards men. So she uses Pip to enact revenge against all men, and Pip thinks that she is his benefactress. Okay, so this is the relationship that they have. Then we have Miss Havisham's attorney, or Miss Havisham is his client, that is Jaggers. Okay, he is a very successful trial lawyer in London, and you have uh, the chief clerk for Jaggers. Okay, that is Wemmick. His name is Wemmick, who is the chief clerk for Jaggers, this lawyer. Okay, so the relationship between Jaggers and Wemmick is strictly business, and there is no emotion involved. But the relationship that Wemmick has, or Pip has with Wemmick, see, they are friends, and Wemmick is also kind of like a mentor for Pip, kind of tries to take care of this young boy Wemmick, who's the clerk of Jaggers. Okay. Then you have Molly. Molly is the servant of Jaggers, who is in fact the real mother of Estella. Okay, Miss Havisham adopts Estella, and Molly, the servant of this lawyer, is the real mother of Estella. And there is a trial, and Jaggers defends her at the trial. Um, yeah, Miss Havisham and Estella. Look at the relationship between Miss Havisham and Estella. She Estella is a beautiful girl, very haughty, and she's the adopted daughter of Miss Havisham, a very proud girl, okay, who's the adopted daughter of Miss Havisham. And she taunts and attracts Pip. So she attracts Pip, yet doesn't actually love him properly, just plays with his emotions. And she kind of obeys whatever Miss Havisham wants her to do. So you can say that she's a dutiful student of Miss Havisham, and Miss Havisham has this relationship of very controlling love with Estella. Then the other important character who plays a big role in this novel is Magwitch. Now, he's a convict on the marshes, and he's a source of Pip's expectations, and he's also Estella's father. So Estella's father is actually this criminal Magwitch, and mother is Molly, Jagger's servant. And Magwitch, Magwitch's relationship with Pip. Magwitch is actually Pip's benefactor. He loves Pip, but also uses him. Then the relationship that Pip has with Magwitch. See, Pip fears and despises Magwitch, but then learns to love Magwitch and also tries to help Magwitch escape. Then the other character is Pip's sister, Mrs. Joe, who's an abusive older sister, and Pip hates her. Pip hates, fears her abuse. So he's always abused by her, and she treats him very badly. But who treats him well is his brother-in-law, Joe. Okay, Joe the blacksmith that Pip's sister is married to, Joe Gargery. The relationship between them is one of love. Pip first loves Joe and then snubs him, because when he gets a lot of money and tries to go to London to live the life of a gentleman, he casts Joe aside. He snubs him. But then, towards the end of the novel, you find him reconciling with Joe. He goes back to Joe, and they mend their relationship. So Joe is a very good character. So these are the people that you will find in the novel. Is this clear to you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right. Going on to the next slide. Now we have to understand, what exactly is, now that basically, in short, what is happening in the novel. Let's go on to analyze. Okay. We start with, analyzing what were the changes that was taking place in England at that time. Okay? And Hobsbawm is mentioned in your book. Okay, Hobsbawm was a British historian who wrote about, uh, how industrialization was changing England, the whole project of colonization, and what imperialism was doing. He was a Marxist historian, and his works were very much important and given value to. Now, in Hobbes's Industry and Empire, so basically talking about how, you know, from how England changed from an agrarian situation to a large industrial situation, and what were the changes, and how did it affect the people. So, in Hobsbawm's Industry and Empire, describe uh, the economic history of England during the 19th century. In the first phase of industrial revolution, textiles were the most important products. We might also have studied in our history of colonialism, right? How textiles, especially when the British came here, our native textiles, they destroyed and tried to get people to buy textiles that were produced in their industries, right? Although we had a very flourishing textile industry of our own, that was systematically destroyed by the uh, colonial people, right? So the first phase of industrial revolution, textiles were the most important products. Later, Britain's monopoly over iron, steel, and industrial technology energized its economy. The most dramatic symbol of speed, efficiency, and organization of Britain's industrial economy was the railway. Railway was, you can say, it's a symbol of how Britain was, becoming more and more of an industrial power organization of an industrial economy. Okay, uh, the economy basically ruled by the industries. Someone has unmuted their microphone. Could you please check? Please mute your microphones, please, everyone. Do check, okay? Because we will be, preventing others from listening and hearing properly, okay? Do be mindful of that. I will give you time to speak, and then you can unmute and ask me if there is anything. Okay? Please be careful. Okay, going on. The most dramatic, so first it was textiles, then Britain started gaining monopoly over other industries like iron, steel, etc., and the whole economy in Britain became centralized around these industries, and the railways can be seen as the best symbol of this growing monopoly or growing power of Britain. Then Dickens exposed human dangers on a society where impersonal structures of gigantic industries dominate the human being. So individuals were not given importance. When such a system or such a structure becomes predominant, their individuals' wills or individuals' opinions do not get any importance. So Dickens was trying to show us, the human dangers that is involved in a society that was growing based on these impersonal structures of industrial growth. What happens to uh, an individual human being? That was what uh, Dickens wanted to show through this novel. Now, we're going to study in detail how exactly does that happen. So, the next topic we have to talk about is upward social mobility and mid Victorian society. Now, mid Victorian Britain, enriched by exports to the rest of Europe and by the ruthless exploitation of colonial markets, was internally a land full of opportunities. So, Britain at that time, internally within their country, this was a land of opportunities. Although everywhere else, they were taking advantage of people, whether it is in other parts of Europe or in their colonies, they were ruthlessly exploiting the people. But within the country, within their own country, this was a period where there were opportunities available for people if they could work hard, and they could really have a chance at improving their social situations. So in this rich industrialized society, citizens aspired to, like, as Queen Victoria's Prime Minister Lord Palmerston said, see, constantly trying to raise himself in social scale, not by violence and illegality, but by the steady and energetic exertion of moral and intellectual faculties with which his creator has endowed him. This was a mentality, this quote by uh, Lord Palmerston, who was a prime minister of Queen Victoria. This quote very clearly shows, what was the state of mind of people in those days. They felt that through hard work, through steady, energetic exertion of moral and intellectual faculties, working hard morally and intellectually, uh, using all the powers that God has given human beings, one can actually improve oneself. This was the ideal, this was the Victorian ideal of self improvement that people in that age really adhered to, believed in, and worked for, aspired to. The ideology of self improvement had become very popular. So everyone, believed in this. This was like, if we work hard, we can improve our situation. This was what the Victorian people thought. Okay? Now Dickens was not so easy to accept it. Okay, Dickens felt this is not like that. It doesn't work in such a straightforward manner. Dickens was critically concerned with the internal contradictions within the discourse of self improvement as it was officially articulated, right? The official articulation was that you work hard, you get your just benefits or just merits, right? Deserved rewards for your hard work. But Dickens was not inclined to believe it. Dickens, you know, veered away or steered himself away from just accepting it as it was officially stated. He understood that there were contradictions present within this talk that people were believing in. Within the discourse of self improvement, there were contradictions. And these contradictions become out very clearly when we analyze this novel. Now, uh, what was the ideal, that people wanted at that time? See, the ideal of becoming a gentleman was very much prevalent there, and a gentleman's life meant a life of leisure without really working or sweating or toiling for it. This was, see, an ideal of gentlemanliness that was something that people aspired to get in those days. That was based on a leisured lifestyle rather than on productiveness, on a liberal outlook rather than on professional commitment. So, this was what people wanted, to have a leisurely lifestyle. This was what people wanted, and that meant having a lifestyle like that meant one could become a gentleman. For example, Pip himself realizes that he can win Estella's love only by transforming himself into a gentleman. So, as a village blacksmith's apprentice, Pip realizes he does not have any chance to win this girl who lives in this big mansion called Satis House. So he himself realizes he has to have money, he has to go to London, he has to be able to lead the life of a gentleman. Only then would Estella even look at him. So this was just exactly like people in those days thought. Okay, and if the criminal Magwitch cannot himself hope to acquire gentlemanly status, uh, another example is that of Magwitch. Okay, Magwitch is a convict. He can never hope to acquire the status of a gentleman in society. And he knows that. He still aspires to get this gentlemanly tag attached to him through Pip. That is why he gives money to Pip, and he wants to produce a gentleman through Pip. Okay, so you see this aspiration to become a gentleman was something that people really wanted those days. So, thus, the emergence of gentlemanliness is an important theme in Great Expectations. Now, again, there's another critic called Mikhail Bakhtin, a Soviet critic called Mikhail Bakhtin, and he wrote, "Literature is an inseparable part of culture." Right? So, social history becomes part and parcel of what is written, also, right? This, like what was said of Napoleon Bonaparte when he went to invade any particular place. First, he would send his men ashore to find out works of literature, get books from that place, because he felt that books written about a place or written by people living in a particular place actually tells us more about that place than anything else can. So this is exactly what Bakhtin also seems to say. See, literature is an inseparable part of culture. For example, the movies that you watch, right? It often portrays life as it is now, right? Especially after the lockdown, there's such a lot of movies that come down talking about lockdown. So literature is something which is part and parcel of uh, what is culture at that time. Then, unlike the relatively autonomous middle class public sphere within which Jane Austen's novels had developed, Dickens' novels came out of a cultural field that encouraged the use of representational methods, plot patterns, themes, modes of organization across a wide range of genre and media. So if you compare his work with that of Jane Austen, you can say that if Jane Austen's novels were sort of talking about the middle class public sphere, we can say that Dickens' novels came from a cultural field where uh, there is a wide range of genre being incorporated into the way in which he would write. Even if it is plot patterns or themes or modes of organization, the way in which the novels were organized, all of these things, you would find more elements creeping into the novel than probably it would have done in the time of Jane Austen. While Austen's novels focused on the internal world of the middle and upper class, Dickensian novel based itself on works like Cruikshank's Sketches of London or the radical political satire that appeared in the pages of Punch magazine, which were outside of the novelistic traditions, including the fairy tale. So again, a contrast between what would entail the novels of Austen if you could find internal world of middle class and upper class people in the novels of Austen. In Dickens' novel, you would find something more outside of any novelistic traditions up till that point in time, because you would find political satire coming up and very realistic picture of what is life in London at that time. So such things were part and parcel of Dickensian novel. Even the fairy tale mode, now that requires further explanation. Fairy tale mode is not like again as simple as you see the words there. So how can we find the fairy tale mode in Dickensian novels? Let's see. Now, great expectations under fairy tale. So, expressive elements that germinated in the fairy tale become reactivated in great expectations. So, you kind of you see a kind of new life given to the elements, the stock elements that you would see in fairy tales. Okay, so you would see that having a new life in a novel like Great Expectations. The fairy tale was getting reconstituted as the pleasant children's stories familiar to us today, and also as the supernatural tales of terror that were popular at that time. So this was a time that fairy tales immediately. When you say fairy tales, immediately we think okay, children's stories, right? So this was a time when there was a change happening. Before, earlier than that, it wasn't like that. Fairy tales did not actually mean tales that children could or we could read out to children. It didn't have that connotation. But this was a time when fairy tales were becoming reconstituted or recreated to become pleasant stories for children. Uh, Earlier, I mean, it could also be supernatural tales of terror. Now when Dickens was growing up, he had heard such stories from Mary, a maid who worked in his house. A person called Mary who worked in his house had told such stories to Dickens, so he was familiar with fairy tale, the concepts of fairy tale. Now, going further into this idea of self improvement that we talked about earlier, see, ideas of self improvement and gentlemanliness are very intricately worked into the fabric of Great Expectations. He was exposed all the time to his dissatisfaction with his life in a backward provincial town. His desire to improve himself is projected as understandable and admirable. He tries to better himself by buying books with whatever he could save and tells Miss Havisham, see, upon my knowing nothing and wanting to know everything. So he always wants to change his given condition, right? He was in the early part of his life, he was living in this village, living a hand to mouth existence, working as a blacksmith's apprentice, hardly having enough money to hardly having enough money to make ends meet. But then, even in that situation, he would tell Miss Havisham that, with whatever money he could save, he would buy books, because he would tell her that, I know nothing and I want to know everything. So that idea of self improvement and becoming a gentleman was embedded in him right from the early period. Now, in the world of great expectations, improvement implies emulating the arrogant, genteel behavior embodied in Miss Havisham and Estella. So, becoming a gentle man or a gentle woman, another aspect of it was becoming arrogant. You can see examples in the way in which Miss Havisham behaves or Estella behaves. Now, see, in the world of great expectations, improvement implies emulating, means behaving in a similar manner to the arrogant, genteel behavior, like the polished, sophisticated behavior with which Miss Havisham and Estella behaved. And Pip's exposure to Satis house arouses in him the desire for a better life. It also exposes him to the full blast of class arrogance. So, the upper class and the arrogance with which they behave towards people from a lower strata of society. Uh, he sees it, or he becomes exposed to it for the first time when he goes to Satis house. And you could get examples. See, when Estella says, and what coarse hands he has, and what thick boots. So when Estella sees Pip, she notices that Pip is wearing unfashionable shoes and he has the hands of a workman. He has thick, coarse, rough hands. Okay, so she talks about it, she comments about it. And you see later Pip saying that, see, Pip feels, I had never thought of being ashamed of my hands before, but I began to consider them a very indifferent pair. Her contempt for me was so strong that it became infectious and I caught it. So Pip, who had never felt inhibited about his own body or the way in which he dressed or anything, he suddenly feels inferior. He's made to feel inferior by the arrogant behavior of Estella. And so he says, the things that I had never noticed about myself, I suddenly became aware in the company of Estella. And I started feeling ashamed for my rough hands and the way in which I dressed, the crude clothes that I was wearing. So you see here that this ideal of self improvement has several layers to it, right? So, in fact, people who want to get into this ideal of self improvement are made to feel dissatisfaction with their own life and their own person also. So, it's kind of a discriminating behavior that comes, right? Where they're made to feel aware of their social class. Going on. Now, the self improving hero and the problem of his past. So, when he gets money after the sensational reversal in his fortunes, Pip represses the most humiliating experiences of his childhood. So he has, he has spent a childhood where he was made to be aware that he is not as rich as anyone else. He doesn't have an inheritance. He doesn't live in a manor. All of these things, he's already made to become aware of these things, uh, and after he gets all this money, a lot of money, he wants to stay as far away from the experiences of his childhood as possible. And see, you can see the example given there. Estella is saying, Since your change of fortune and prospects, you have changed your companions, said Estella. Naturally, said I, and necessarily, she added in a haughty tone. What was fit company for you once would be quite unfit for you now. This is an example from the novel, page 258. So she's saying that you have changed, and that was quite necessary, because what was fit for you, what suited you at one point in time, does not seem okay for you now, because now you have inherited money, you've come to London, you're moving in high class society, you're a gentleman. So look at that. So the concept of becoming a gentleman meant distancing himself from his past. So when the gentlemanly Pip comes face to face with Trab, the tailor's boy in his hometown, and affects a serene and unconscious attitude towards him, the result is disaster. You have such sometimes like these comic scenes. Okay, Pip is going back to his village. He does not want to acknowledge any of his old friends. They are like village people, not sophisticated gentlemen like him. And Pip does not pretend that he knows any one of them, especially his old friend Trab, who's a tailor's son. So when he sees Trab on the other side of the road, he walks as if he doesn't know him, and Trab makes fun of him. So see, when Pip meets him in his hometown, Trap walks on the opposite side of the road. This is what he does. See, wriggling his elbows and his body and saying to his attendants, "Don't know ya, don't know ya, upon my soul, don't know ya." That is from page 267 in the novel. Okay, so Trap makes fun of him, for all this airs and affectations that he has. This parodic reenactment of Estella's pronouncement uh, breaks the codes of gentility. So Estella, you can see what a contrast, right? So Estella, as a member of the genteel community, the genteel society, tells him that it is only right that he should distance himself from the rustic friends that he had in his earlier life. Yet, when he meets one of his friends, one of his childhood friends, the way in which they react, that is almost like a parody of what Estella says. So, the parodic reenactment of Estella's pronouncement breaks the codes of gentility. So, we are Dickens is very clearly giving us through this contrast, how pointless is this whole exercise of trying to become a gentleman. So, from the point of view of excluded majority, these codes appear to be ridiculous posturings, right? Just empty posturings, just showing what you say in Hindi, you say nakras, right? Or jada in Malayalam, we say jada, right? So, from the point of view of the excluded majority, right? Especially the people who are excluded, who these gentlemanly or upper class people feel snobbishly, above all these people. So that kind of feels very fake and very artificial. These codes are broken and they appear to be ridiculous posturings. And Pip's attempt to erase the memory of his old acquaintances from his consciousness is shown to involve snobbery. So, gentlemanliness, acquiring gentlemanliness, does have another side to it, which involves haughty behavior, rude behavior, arrogance, and also snobbery, which when you analyze it through the eyes of Trap, the tailor's boy, this clearly becomes, full of, ridiculous posturings. There. But the best example you get of this happening is with Joe, the relationship that he has with Joe. Joe, his sister's husband, his brother-in-law, who was almost like a father to Pip. Okay? So it is with Joe that Pip's newly found gentlemanliness is at its most complex depiction. The most complex example of the relationship changing with the acquisition of wealth is depicted through the relationship that Pip has with Joe. Joe and Pip are, in Joe's words, ever the best of friends, and in Pip's terms, equals. They considered, equal to each other. Joe's utter incapacity to relate to the conventions of gentility raises major problems for Pip after he becomes a gentleman. So Joe is a straightforward man, simple and straightforward. He does not want to acquire the airs and habits uh, of the rich people. So Joe's inability to rise to changes and situations really affects the way in which Pip becomes a gentleman. Okay, Pip's readjusted behavior in the gentlemanly society is shown not simply as progress but also as something that is capable of destroying the deepest and most undemanding of personal relationships. So when Pip readjusts his behavior, when Pip behaves like a rich gentleman and stops becoming or stops the close relationship that he had with Joe, uh, he he's shown as breaking, a relationship that was worth so much for him, the deepest and most undemanding of personal relationship. That was a relationship that he had with Joe. Okay, so that is what gets destroyed in this process. Just a minute, okay, 1 second, hold on.
Okay, ma'am.
Just a minute. uh, 1 second, okay. Okay, can you see in my presentation?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
all right. Okay, going back to the slideshow. Let me go back to it. So what was I saying? Yeah, so the biggest loss, I mean, although the relationship that he had with Trab and other friends of his gets broken, the biggest casualty that happens with this change in attitude of Pip is the relationship that he has with Joe, his brother-in-law, who loved him almost like a father. And going on to the next one. Yeah, uh, gentlemanliness and love. Okay, so mid-Victorian people were fascinated with this air of romance, heroism, superiority that seemed to surround the aristocrats, and were quite taken up with aristocrats and the kind of love and the kind of heroism, the sense of superiority that they associated with the aristocrats. Now, in Great Expectations, Dickens is showing how this exterior grandeur was contradictory to the capacity to love genuinely. So, this was all posturing, ridiculous posturing, like we saw in the previous slide. So, Dickens in Great Expectations shows very clearly that all of uh, these qualities that the common man associated with aristocracy was all uh, really fake and superficial and did not really have any depth to it. It actually prevented people from the higher class in society to love sincerely. As you can see, how Estella could not love sincerely, or Miss Havisham has this arrogant and deprecatory attitude towards Pip. Now, as a young boy, Pip felt everything picturesque and magnificent had to do with Miss Havisham, Estella, and Satis House, because that was the exposure that he had got. He was a village boy. He was a blacksmith's apprentice, and the greatest symbol of wealth and gentlemanly behavior in upper class society that he had seen was when he went to Satis House. So he associated everything uh, that was magnificent with Miss Havisham and Estella and this Satis house. Now, Pip's anguished reaction to Estella's impending marriage with Drummel expresses the intensity with which Pip had loved Estella, which was to him the highest point of his quest for improvement. his whole life, his desire to improve himself, it was based on his love for Estella. But Estella, although she knows it, she does not give this relationship any value. So Pip's reaction to Estella's marriage with Drummel is an example of how this all the high value that people give to aristocrats, and this quality of gentlemanliness actually just means empty nothings. Estella's response to Pip's love is cold, unfeeling. She has been trained by Miss Havisham to wreak revenge on the male sex. Through Estella, Miss Havisham is trying to live her life of revenge for having been left at the altar by Compison, who was her fiance. So that has made Miss Havisham bitter, and through Estella, she takes revenge against the entire male sex. She is not only hard hearted in love, but very cold and inaccessible in her beauty. So she has groomed Estella to become a girl, although beautiful, has the coldest of hearts. Now, with this depiction of Pip and Estella's relationship, Dickens explains how gentlemanliness and the world of the genteel does not necessarily go with fine feelings and emotions. So, everything that the common man associated with aristocracy was just fake, right? So, being a gentleman or belonging to a higher class in society does not necessarily mean that these people have better feelings, finer feelings, or deeper emotions. In fact, it means just the contrary, just the opposite, as is exemplified by the Pip and Estella relationship. Going on, then, uh, so improvement or disintegration. So this is another question that we ask ourselves. Let me quickly, once again, use my pointer. So, Great Expectations projects the hero in his increasing awareness of the violent, often irreconcilable contradictions inherent to his improving journey. So, this novel is showing us this hero who becomes more and more aware of the violence and contradictions that is part and parcel of his self improving journey. The hero, that is Pip, who becomes aware that, just getting money, just going to London, just like, adopting the lifestyle of a gentleman does not make him a gentleman. Okay, and it's not as simple as that. uh, let's see, how there are two books, okay, that were popular at that time. See, Smiles' book Self-Help and John Stuart Mill's autobiography. uh, in these books, self-culture is conceptualized as something that is successive, categorizable, and additive terms, and leading to an integrated sense of self. So this was how it was portrayed, self improvement. So a self culture, or taking ourselves to a so called higher level. In these two books, that is Self Help and John Stuart Mill's autobiography, it was pictured as something, as a journey that was additive. In each step, a little bit more would be added until it led to, like almost top of the pinnacle, and an integrated sense of self. But it was not like that. It did not really happen like that. Although you can say, in a typical Bildungsroman, the hero is exposed to inner turmoil and subsequent emotional growth, as Dickens portrayed in David Copperfield, where the hero's troubles are part of his education and growth. So we can say that Dickens does not see self improvement as happening in steadily additive steps leading to the highest version of oneself. It does not happen like that. In fact, we can consider this novel also, Great Expectations, also as a Bildungsroman. Bildungsroman is a German term, okay, which means a novel where the central character comes to a realization of the self, comes to understanding himself through a journey which leads in education, a journey through difficulties, which leads to his own education, which leads to self awareness, and becoming mature. As the time passes, he embarks on a journey to maturity. Such a kind of novel is called a Bildungsroman. And Dickens' own novel, David Copperfield, we can say that that is like an example of a Bildungsroman, where the hero's troubles become part of his education, the process of education, whereby he learns and he grows to a maturer self, more mature self. In David Copperfield, the character of homely Betsy Trotwood makes his entry into middle class world smooth. So, Bildungsroman is a novel where the central character, from a young age, tries to understand himself, undergoes hardships and difficulties, learning process, leading to education of himself to a point of maturity. Now, example we gave as David Copperfield. In David Copperfield, there is a character of Betsy Trotwood, who is a character who helps David Copperfield to come to self-realization, come to sort of an understanding of the middle class world. But in Great Expectation, this transition of Pip from from a young blacksmith apprentice to gentleman to finally realizing it, that is not everything. That journey is not made easy by any supporting figure. In fact, the person that he completely believes in, that is Miss Havisham, only hampers his growth, right? Because he thinks she might be his benefactress, when in fact she had not done nothing except probably spoil even Estella's personality, right? Even made Estella incapable of loving anyone. So this this process of self improvement is not without its own complications in Great Expectations. So, in Great Expectations, see, the strangeness of Miss Havisham, Saddest house, prompts Pip to aspire for a fine life, but also leaves him disturbed and confused. Pip is forced to interact with characters in unusual and provoking situations that seem to be testing his progress at every step. So, at every step, he kind of loses faith in himself. He questions himself. So that is the way in which his growth takes place. Now, this opens Pip to introspection, which Bakhtin terms as self consciousness. Another critic, French critic, he terms this as self consciousness. When Pip becomes aware that he thinks about what he has done with his life, that leads to introspection, looking within, looking inwards. That is introspection. So, French critic Roland Barthes used the term disclosure, which can be applied to dismantling of Pip's sense of self, and later gives logical and moral coherence to the story. Roland Barthes, another critic, he uses the term disclosure that he can apply, to uh, Pip's sense of self is dismantled, is completely taken apart, because he thinks that he is living the life of a gentleman in London based on the the benefactory behavior of Miss Havisham, when in fact he was living with blemished money, right? Tainted money, the money of Magwitch, who was a convict. So he was so his sense of self is constantly being dismantled, and Roland Barthes calls this term disclosure. And that realization is what actually later on gives logical and moral coherence to this whole story. When he realizes it, that is when he goes through this process of thinking about it, introspection, and that actually gives coherence to the story. Now, see, in Great Expectations, the disclosure in Great Expectations is Pitt's discovery that his gentlemanly status has been sustained by a criminal's money, Magwitch's money. It makes it impossible for him to either belong to gentlemanly society or go back to the provincial world of his past. So he is unable to, become a gentleman in this so-called gentlemanly society of London, because his money is the money that he has inherited is not um, money that is coming from a good source. It is a money that was given to him by a convict. So that kind of taints him, that kind of poisons it for him. At the same time, he has come so far, he cannot go back to the provincial, to the rural village lifestyle of his past. So that is where disclosure leads to dismantling of his self, which leads to introspection, which again we can say adds to the logical and the moral coherence of the story. This is what gives depth to the story. So there's a whole aspiration to become a gentleman, and what happens as a result of understanding that it's not a simple additive process. So again, going to the next part here, improvement or disintegration. Now, book three of Great Expectations. In book three, we are going to look at one particular aspect, okay, one particular part of this book, book three. In book three, instead of arriving at a comfortable relationship with society, Pip's situation is characterized by a sense of homelessness. Instead of integrating, Pip finds himself pushed to the very brink of extinction. So, in book three, you find Pip going through some of the worst challenges that he has ever faced. He loses a sense of where is home. He does not know, he doesn't belong to the city, neither does he belong to the village. So, a state of homelessness, and morally and physically, there are several challenges that he has to face, and he's even faced with an attempt on his life. So, after Pip exhausts himself walking to deal with the news of Estella's marriage, he gets a note from Wemmick warning him not to go home. So, he is literally not asked to go home. Wemmick, his mentor, that is Jagger's clerk, sends him a note asking him not to go home. He is distraught. At that point in the book, you see that Pip is totally distraught with the news of Estella's marriage, and to work it out, to deal with this devastating news, he walks around the city, and he gets a note from Bernick asking him not to go home. He's forced to spend the night at an inn, and Wemmick's note plates itself around his consciousness as a bodily pain would have, until it is transformed from a simple fact to a vast shadowy verb which expresses the central reality about his present existence. So instead of going home, he takes a room in an inn and spends the night there. And at night, he has a nightmare in which the words on Wemmick's note that you should not go home kind of seems to wrap itself around his consciousness, almost like a bodily pain would have, kind of paralyzing him, and it becomes from a simple fact asking him not to go home, this becomes a shadowy verb, a shadowy action. This person, unable to go home, is like a lost soul who does not know where to find comfort in. So that's how it becomes, it sort of becomes the reality of his present existence. So that is when you see the hero questioning himself, asking relevant questions, learning, undergoing this through experience, undergoing this process of self learning. Pip's encounter, another important thing that happens in that book is how he meets with Orlick. Orlick was a character who attacked his sister long back. Orlick attacked Pip's sister, and she died from the wounds later on. So Orlick is a villainous character, and Pip prevents Orlick from getting a job later on. So Orlick has a lot of resentment towards Pip. And that time, that day, when he's already distraught with news of Estella's marriage and everything, Orlick attacks him and tries to kill him. So that is what is meant here by Pip's encounter with Orlick and the possibility of dying pushes his quest for improvement to collapse. So metaphorically, you can say that this character meets with the biggest block in this road to self-realization, and it almost collapses because Orlick tries to kill him. They have an encounter in which Pip almost dies until he's rescued. So, who's Orlixi? A day laborer in Joe's forge. He attacks Mrs. Joe and attempts to murder Pip. That's what this is about. Then, a recurring motive throughout the Pip Orlick encounter is the sluggish, stifling smoke that emanates from the lime kiln in the neighboring neighborhood, accentuating the possibility of death and disappearing without a trace. So, the motive, what is the motive? A recurrent pattern that comes up in a book, just like we have motifs on our clothes, right? Our saris have designs and patterns on them that are repeated again and again. That is a motif. So just like that in the book, the encounter, the with Pip and Orlick, Orlick trying to murder Pip, a recurring motif that happens throughout that encounter is Pip feeling very sluggish, unable to take action and unable to breathe, stifled feeling. That actually happens because they're fighting in the neighborhood of a lime kiln, which is emitting smoke, preventing Pip from being able to breathe properly. But when you analyze this motive, this is something that symbolizes the possibility of an ending, of disappearing without a trace. So it can be analyzed in that way also. Now, what gives purpose to Pitt's lost life is his resolution to help his criminal benefactor. Uh, Before that, he realizes his money has not come from a good source. The woman he loved, Estella, is marrying someone else. Miss Havisham is not the benefactress that he had thought to be. So, on every count, all his expectations have been destroyed. But then you find the book picking up the character and trying to give meaning to his life. How does meaning come to Pip's life? See, what gives purpose to Pip's lost life is his resolution to help his criminal benefactor, Magwitch, evade the law. So, Magwitch has come back to London and he wants to evade the police. So, Pip decides that I'm going to help Magwitch. Now, Dickens' delineation of Pip's delirium may be read as a paradigmatic of a compositional method that aims not at integration but at disordering. So, Pip goes into a delirium, a kind of, state where he's not conscious of what is happening to him after all the shocks that he suffers. He loses it, kind of loses it. And you can say that Dickens tries to show through Pip's delirium, an example of a compositional paradigmatic means example of a compositional method where you see not integration but disordering. Pip, Pip does not integrate into the accepted modes of behavior in society at that time, but rather takes himself away from that, away from the accepted modes of behavior, reassesses his own self, and that is how he comes to a point of maturity, understanding his own self, not going the uh, with this whole process of integrating into accepted beliefs. So that is where you see Dickens' mastery. Now, in the concluding pages of Great Expectations, Dickens makes an attempt to rehabilitate Pip and to integrate his life to the unostentatious and productive middle class world. So, last pages, you see Pip going back to the village and trying to, live life along with his loving brother-in-law, Joe. So, you find the character understanding that everything that he ran after was not really worth it, and he goes back to the village and he tries to lead the life of productivity. uh, he does not want to go after this lifestyle of leisurely gentleman that he had run after for by going to London. So he loses all that feeling and he understands what is the real truth, and he goes back to his village. Now, in Pip's resurrection, this is how Dickens resurrects the character of Pip. We might see an instance of the process by which official ideologies are both criticized and incorporated in the Dickensian text, and yet it is all enabled by the same tainted money. Example, Pip's help in securing Herbert's partnership. So, uh, one of the things that redeems the character of Pip is how uh, we see the character going against official ideologies which talked about uh, inheritance and gentlemanly lifestyle and all that. Pip realizes that the hollowness behind all this, and he goes against the official ideologies. This is criticized, but also incorporated into Dickens' presentation, because it is using this money that Magwitch gives him, that Pip is able to help his friend Herbert from a lot of debts that he owes. So he is able to help Herbert get a partnership using Magwitch's tainted money. So that, in a way, that tainted money is put to a good use by Pip. Moving on. Now, great expectations and the fairy tale. So we did mention fairy tale earlier. Let's go into deeper study about it. The fairy tale as a historically complex mode. Now, fairy tales in the 18th and even the 19th century often represented the ways in which the poor and not so poor continue to speak to each other. So, something that bridged the gap between the poor and the not poor. Apart from somber atmosphere, brutal language, they used the magical elements within fairy tales as means of confronting their readers with confusing paradoxes and desperate choices. So, something that had the capacity to speak across social class to the people. Grimm's edited out unsuitable material for children to convert fairy tales to a pleasant mode of instructions. So before Grimm's edited out the fairy tales to suit or to create it into something that can be used as pleasurable reading for children. Before that, this was a means by which people across social classes could speak and address each other. Now, treating Dickens' novel as a fairy tale is a reductive approach. So it's not just a fairy tale, like with the connotations that we have with it today as being something fit for children to read. It's not like that. You cannot see Great Expectations as just a fairy tale. It has depth to it, but also elements of fairy tale. Look at how it is. See? It enabled Dickens to use bipolar aspects of fairy tale to subvert the conventional society's attempts to preserve its own sanctity. So it kind of helped Dickens to use, this fairy tale aspect of bipolarity, good versus bad. Okay, in fairy tale you have, right, the good fairy and the bad witch. Most of the fairy tales work on that sort of premise, but here in Dickens' story, you can see how that has been subverted. Subvert is a favorite word of ours. We've encountered it earlier also, right? It turns everything upside down, subverts a conventional society's attempts to preserve its own sanctity. There is we cannot, like, the world cannot be just seen through polarities, right? There is always a gray area in between, and that is what Dickens brings out through his novel. Now, realism and the fairy tale. Let's see how he does that. Okay, Satter's house scenes are described almost entirely from the point of view of Pip. Has all the somber atmosphere and confusing elements associated with original fairy tales. Using the fairy tale elements, Dickens links it to the mode of novel which was associated with the educated classes. So, Pip is the one who described Satter's house to us. It has all the somber and confusing elements associated with earlier fairy tale before Grimm's edited it out to become sort of a children's story. Before that, when it had more of a darker and more somber tone to it, that kind of thing, that kind of uh, uh, feel you get when you read a fairy tale, that you get when Pip sees Satis house for the first time. Using fairy tale elements, Dickens links it to the mode of the novel, which was associated with the educated classes. Now, Roland Barthes insists the sense of reality is created when connotations concealed beneath the simple meaning of words supplement each other and come together in operations of solidarity. So Roland Barthes again, we mentioned him earlier. He says that the sense of reality is created when connotations concealed beneath simple meanings of words supplement each other and come together when they work together. For example, here it doesn't happen like that. In Great Expectations, it actually doesn't happen like that. Let me give you an example. Okay, when I say birthday cake, for example, okay, if I say birthday cake, immediately you picture a birthday cake, you picture celebration, you picture moments of happiness, right? So Roland Barthes says that a sense of reality is created when connotations concealed beneath simple meanings of words operates in solidarity, or acts in solidarity and supplements each other. So the word and the meaning supplement each other. Then uh, it kind of, sense of reality is created. But here, in this book, so what happens is, see, in Satter's house, Pip says everything that ought to have been white was white long ago, had lost its luster, was faded and yellow, and the bride within the bridal dress had withered like the dress, and the flowers had no brightness but the brightness of her sunken eyes. So all of these are symbols uh, in its proper connotations would have symbolized happiness, right? A wedding gown, a wedding cake, flowers. All of these in its proper connotations would have symbolized something positive. Yet, analyze, seeing it through Pip's eyes, you realize that there are concealed connotations that bring out the real meaning of these words to us, right? We realize that nothing is proper, nothing is as it should be in Satis house, especially the character of Miss Havisham, because she wanders around wearing her wedding gown. The wedding gown, which should have been white and fresh, is now, see, lost its luster and was faded and yellow, and the bride within the bridal dress had withered like the dress. So she also had become an old woman, wrinkled and withered like this yellowing old bridal dress. And the flowers that would have been part of the wedding was also uh, withered, completely withered. And the eyes of a bride versus the sunken eyes of an old lady who's bitter, who's revengeful, that would be quite a contrast, isn't it? So when you see the words and you realize the setting in which this word is placed, then we realize the true meaning of uh, how Pip is seeing these things. So, it creates in Satis House a site where the attributes of an elegant lifestyle can be tensely juxtaposed against death, decay, and madness. So you see here elements of an elegant lifestyle, like, of all the wealth that he sees in Satis House, the characters that he sees in Satis House, the dresses that they wear, the atmosphere in the house, all of these attributes of an elegant lifestyle can be tensely juxtaposed, can be placed against each other, and can actually indicate death and decay and madness. That is exemplified very clearly in the character of Miss Havisham, the way in which she dresses, the madness that is present in her character, uh, which prompts her to take revenge on all men. As Barthes puts it, the effect of reality is an illusion created by surreptitious or orchestration of connotations. or the additional bits of meaning that cling to others' language over and above what it literally states. So, when you say that the bridal dress that Miss Satis was wearing was yellowing, the author is not saying anything to us explicitly, but we as readers can go over and above what is said to us and understand that Pip is describing it. Pip sees everything decaying, everything, the flowers are withered, the woman inside the gown herself is wrinkled and withered. So when we read this over and above what the author tells us, we are able to understand and put together things and understand that Satyr's house, far from representing a house of power and wealth, only portrays what is decaying, what is going towards death, a certain element of madness that is present. So that is what happens when you look at the connotations, so additional meanings that you see beyond the dictionary meaning, denotations and connotations. The dictionary meaning of a word can be called as like denotations, but connotations are layers of meaning that are attached to a word. So this is what happens here in Satyr's house. Now, in Dickens' novelization of the fairy tale, signs lose their stability. Far from fixing reality in black and white terms, signifiers in Satyr's house scenes carry within themselves a possibility of their own reversal. For example, as we just saw, a signifier such as Miss Havisham's wedding dress suggests both celebration and decay. So Barth, when he was talking about his critical theories, he introduced two things, signs, a signifier and a signified. Uh, like a signifier can be seen as look at this here, explanation I put here. Can you see my pointer? So signifier being the physical form of the sign. Okay, the sign of wedding, the physical form of that would be probably a wedding ring, right? Or the wedding gown. That is a sign, okay, as we perceive it through our senses. And signified is the meaning that is interpreted from it. Suppose you see the signifier, in this case, the wedding gown of Miss Havisham, for example. It's a sign. If it had been white and clean and fresh, we would have associated, the signification would have been that of happiness. But here it is yellowing, it is faded, it's not fresh, right? So we immediately understand that the signification or the way in which we interpret its meaning is something that portrays sadness, portrays death and decay. So that is what is said here. So signs lose their stability. So the signs do not, signs, for example, the wedding gown or the character of Miss Havisham, right? It loses its stability, and we are not able to fix meaning. A wedding gown does not always mean happiness, right? A wedding ring does not always mean happiness. So we are not unable to fix its meaning. So the signs lose their stability, and far from fixing its meaning, there is an area beyond the polarities of black and white, an area beyond the black and white area that we see. And the signifiers in Satyr's house scenes carry within themselves the possibility of their own reversal. All of these signifiers that you see in Satyr's house can turn back upon itself. For example, see, Miss Havisham's wedding dress suggests both celebration and decay. Might have been celebratory at one point in time in the past, but now it symbolizes decay and death. So you see that nowhere do we see a stable meaning being associated. Then, in Great Expectations, a system of secondary or connotative meanings are brought together to constitute the real. So, what is real? The real is not what is said explicitly to us, but rather something that we understand from the connotations of the explanation, what it means to us when we read the explanations. So the connotative meanings are brought to us to show us what is real. Real is something that we have to understand from what we interpret through the signified things, through the signs and how they are signified. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. All right. Then, retaining the subversiveness and ambiguities in its original form, it breaks free from the hegemony of the ways in which those with access to power and education represent the world. So, again, see, it retains Dickens' novel has this power, has this ability to subverse, right? Completely subvert again, turn upside down. Uh, s- Retaining subversiveness and ambiguities in its original form. So, ambiguities means area of doubt. We're not sure of it. There are areas of doubt. Okay? So, ambiguities in its original form, this novel actually breaks free from the hegemony of the ways in which those with access to power and education represent the world. So, people with access to money, education, power, how they represent the world. That is not the way in which Dickens shows us the world. So, it breaks free of the system of power, the hegemony of the way in which those who have access to wealth and education see the world. So we see the world from a subverted point of view, through which Dickens shows to us, that this concept of gentle manliness, this concept of self improvement is not something as simplistic as happening in steps that are constantly taking us towards the final goal. It doesn't happen in such a simplistic way at all. Going on. Now, the conventional fairy tale and how it's deformed. Okay, Great Expectations absorbs the conventional fairy tale plot not to replicate its simple oppositional paradigm, but in order to deform it. So we are able to break it down to this conventional fairy tale plot. What Dickens does is not to replicate the conventional fairy tale plot, but rather to deform it and break it down. Now, the Russian formalists, the Russian formalists were a group of critics who first developed this idea of deformation. The Russian formalists thought of deformation as variations that individual authors brought about in certain well known plot patterns in order to achieve their distinctive effect. So, the plot pattern could be something which is very familiar, but individual writers can treat it in such a way that we see the truth in a different way. The way in which they present it can be uh, completely unique, and that is what the Russian formalists called as deformation. See, variations that individual authors brought about, okay, to certain well-known plots and achieving their distinctive effect. Now, Bakhtin gave the term its larger resonance when he argued that most effective form of deformations were based on certain displacements and recombinations of semantic uh, values such that a transfer of ideological value occurs. So Bakhtin said that, based on certain displacements, and recombinations of semantic value, uh, the meaning attached to a word, okay, semantic values, a transfer of ideological value occurs. So the ideological value itself can shift grounds when it is presented to us in a different format, and that is what Dickens does here. A well-known plot, he is able to deform it. He is able to present it in a very individual manner, a distinctive manner that makes us understand, that there has been a transfer of the accepted ideologies, so far accepted ideologies, and we are made to see the world from a different perspective. Complexity that underlies the relationship between conventional fairy tale plot and great expectations. Let us see what how the complex it is. Okay, conventional fairy tale plot versus great expectations. First example again is Miss Havisham. Suppose fairy godmother in the fairy tale like plot of Pip's expectations. The ambiguity, the area of grayness, lies at the heart of Dickens' conceptualization of Miss Havisham, rendering her in Pip's eyes as both fairy godmother and witch. So, Miss Havisham, in Pip's eyes, in the beginning, she was like a fairy godmother, right? In fairy tales, you normally have a fairy godmother, like Cinderella story, like how the fairy godmother gives her everything that she wants. So that is a kind of, we also think, right, in the beginning that okay, Miss Havisham might have helped him get the money and everything. But later on, as the story progresses, we understand rather than being a fairy godmother, she's the opposite of that. She's almost like the evil witch there, right? So you can see the gray area coming up in the character of Miss Havisham. How Pip's earlier images of Miss Havisham gets completely turned around. Then another example, Miss Havisham has a stick that she holds in her hand, a walking stick, a crutch. Okay, it's a symbol of her deformity. Look at the character. Look at what a an excellent craftsman Dickens is. He makes this character have a crutch, which is a symbol of crutches people use when they cannot walk, right? Now, metaphorically, Miss Havisham is a woman who can no longer walk through the ways of this world anymore, right? Once betrayed, once abandoned at the altar, she becomes revengeful, she becomes deformed, right? That deformation is something that has happened in her heart, not only physical and external, but also internal, deforming her very heart, very character. So you can see Miss Havisham's crutch, a symbol of her deformity, becomes at the same time a signifier of her benign magical powers. So it could be, the crutch could be seen as the wand, right? Like fairies have this magic wand, right? That they wave around and create magic. So it can become a signifier that could probably, show magical powers in a fairy. But see, in Miss Havisham, in her role as a fairy godmother, is juxtaposed against her rotting wedding cake. So here, she is not shown as a fairy godmother who brings miracles or magic into the lives of the characters around her. Rather, she's seen almost like an evil witch, right? Especially surrounded by the faded and decaying remains of her wedding day. For example, the wedding cake, rotting remains of the wedding cake. Pip thinks she had adopted Estella and she had as good as adopted me, and it could not fail to be her intention to bring us together. This is what Pip thinks, but that's far from the truth. We know it, right? He thinks, Miss Havisham could be the one who has given me money. She has adopted Estella, a girl whose parentage was doubtful, but probably in the same manner, she has adopted me also and is trying to help me in life and has given and has become the secret benefactor to me. This is what Pip thinks, okay? But revelations that link Miss Havisham to the criminal Compeyson and bind both Pip and Estella inextricably to Magwitch makes the act of deforming conventional fairy tale plot simultaneous with the smashing of basic moral boundary by which Pip and indeed the larger gentlemanly society preserves its sanctity. So, all the things that Pip had thought about himself and even Estella about herself, all that becomes completely shattered. uh, Miss Havisham also. Miss Havisham has spent her entire life mourning how she was abandoned by the man she loved, that is Compeyson. And later it is revealed that Compeyson is a hardened criminal, and he is the one who actually is instrumental in getting Magwitch arrested. So Compeyson is not the ideal man that Miss Havisham had imagined him to be. He is in fact a hardened criminal. So there also, see, you can see what was thought and what is reality becomes completely different. And the next example is Pip and Estella. Pip gets everything in life from the inheritance that comes to him. And later on, Pip realizes that the money has come from criminal Magwitch. And Estella is also inextricably related to Magwitch. Estella, who prides herself uh, on being, a snob and kind of an upper class girl, she realizes that she is the daughter of this criminal Magwitch who's running away from the law. So that also breaks everything, right? So through this very act of deforming the conventional fairy tale plot, at the same time, uh, who gives Pip the money? Not the expected fairy godmother, but this criminal Magwitch. He's the one who gives Pip the money. So this act of deforming the conventional fairy tale plot is also simultaneous. It goes hand in hand with the smashing of the basic moral boundary by which Pip preserves his sanctity. Not only Pip, the larger part of this gentlemanly society preserves its sanctity. So people think, that there is a firm division between good and bad, evil and good, but there really isn't, right? So you find that the gray areas kind of confuse things. And going on, in crime and respectability. So that is what this thing is. So good versus bad, there is always a gray area. Crime versus respectability, also there is a gray area. it, we cannot divide society into areas that are inhabited only by the respectable people, and areas where the criminals occupy. It does not work like that. These two societies do not exist in watertight compartments. That will become clear when we read this. In Dickens' early fiction, crime, whether it is located in the psychotic individual or in the poverty ridden landscape of the other London, is never allowed to infiltrate the processes of respectability. So, this is how he wrote in his earlier novels. Okay, crime on another sphere and respectability on another sphere. But in his later fiction, Dickens, blurs this relationship, kind of blurs his relationship between criminality and respectability, and he shows us the relationship between criminality and respectability, far from being located in the margins of respectable society, becomes integral to it. So this whole question of criminality becomes very integral, very much part and parcel of the so-called respectable society. For example, see, respectability in Great Expectation seems to emerge as an internally consistent social sphere capable of isolating criminality, disassociating it from everyday reality. Convicts are socially, culturally, and even biologically separated from the respectable. So they are shown as people to be despised, the criminals, whether it is Compeyson or Magwitch, they're shown as people to be despised. Okay? So Magwitch is the inscrutable other of Victorian respectability. The other, the one who is always outside of society. That is termed by the word other here. You can see a picture of Magwitch getting hold of Pip. This is the first time that they meet. So Magwitch is an example of the unscrutable other of Victorian society, this other who inhabits the dark, incomprehensible domain outside respectability. So at that point, as a convict, he cannot become part and parcel of respectable society. So he's this other, the one who stands outside of any accepted area of society. Magwitch is an example of that. Magritt's career illustrates how penal techniques in Great Expectations aim not at eliminating crime but in encouraging recidivism, that is a tendency to a tendency of convicted criminals to re-offend. So Magwitch is forever running from the hands of law, okay, which is an example of, rather than, rehabilitating these criminals, the penal techniques that existed in Britain at that time, were penal techniques that actually made the convicts do crime again, or do acts of crime again, relapsing into recidivism. That means offending again, going against law again and again. So this concept of rehabilitating was not part of the legal procedures those days. Then laws provide objective system of arbitration. Okay, this is shedding light on the way in which law and legalities worked at that time. Laws provide objective system of arbitration. The accused is given certain rights. He or she is convicted only by trial in court, and arguments are evaluated in court. Okay, so that was a given thing, So they did have trials that were conducted in court. Yet, uh, again, going into the gray areas, into the areas that blur criminality with respectability, we see that Jagger's success, this lawyer Jagger, his successes in court depended on his ability to manipulate, repress, and confuse facts on his access to Newgate, the biggest prison in London. So he used to win cases. Jaggers used to win cases by manipulating the people, by twisting the facts, by the access that he had to the that criminals who lived or who were imprisoned in Newgate prison, the, the biggest, excuse me, the biggest prison in London. So Jaggers, used to go and negotiate with the criminals and get information from them, which he would use to his benefit in the cases that came up for trial. This was the way in which he used to win his cases. So you see there again, Jaggers as a lawyer, as arguing his cases in the courts, could be seen as part of the respectable, so-called respectable crowd. Yet at the same time, he got his sustenance from the, Newgate prison, which is, the headquarters for all the convicts. So you see where the so-called areas of criminality and areas of respectability seem to feed off each other, seem to kind of merge into this area of grayness. So continuing on that, see, Jaggers has a reputation of being more in secrets of that dismissal place than any man in London. So he goes to Newgate prison. He talks to the convicts there, and he knows the secrets of all the convicts, which he uses in his cases. So he makes effective use of Newgate intelligence and court, using a whole range of illegalities to fight a case while keeping himself on the right side of law. So legal loopholes, like that is what a lot of lawyers do even today, right? Using all legal loopholes, he is able to win all the cases in court and making himself a very successful lawyer. But from where does he get the loopholes? From the secrets, from the Newgate intelligence that he gets. So though he is a very successful lawyer, the roots of his success lies with the secrets that he's able to get from the criminals in the prison. So, criminality, far from being a solid, easily identifiable mass of activities that exists outside respectable society, is ambiguous, something that constantly circulates through the fine underground channels that connect Newgate to the High Court. So, we cannot say that respectability is completely removed from criminality, right? So they merge and they circulate together. Newgate, the secrets of Newgate circulate to feed on what happens in the High Court. So, in Great Expectations, the most palpable symbol of this constant traffic between criminality and respectability is the wealth that is generated in the criminal milieu but recycled back into respectable society. Like, the wealth that Magwitch got, it is given to Pip, and it becomes recycled. It becomes something that feeds the so-called respectable society. So the two are forever linked with each other. Then criminal wealth and respectability. Okay, so Jaggers himself does not even attempt to conceal the criminal origins of his wealth. And Wemmick stops at the individual cells at Newgate not only to gather intelligence or locate appropriate witnesses, but also to negotiate fees. The acquisition of criminal property, especially the property of prisoners condemned to death, has become a routine for Wemmick, Jaggers' clerk. So Jaggers gets intelligence and information from the prison, and Wemmick also goes around the prison negotiating fees from the criminals and even acquiring the land of prisoners who are sentenced to death, maybe promising them an escape from their sentences or something. He is also able to negotiate and make deals. So they are actually profiting from the criminals. These two are examples of people who are actually making money um, from these criminals. Now, Magwitch's money, on the other hand, see here, Magwitch's money, the criminal's money, provides material basis for Pip's life as a gentleman. So, how the money from the criminal side of the world circulates and is made part of this so-called respectable world. But Pip's refusal to use Magwitch's money can only be symbolic because his education, his acquisition of culture, values, and friends, in short, his improvement, is all tied up to Magwitch's money. So Pip refuses this money and he uses it for good purpose. In the final analysis, it is this bringing together of the gentleman and the criminal, and at a more general level, refinement and corruption. The Fairy Godmother and the Witch, which expresses Dickens' radical skepticism with assertions about the possibility of self improvement. So, through all of these um, opposites, right, through all of these examples, like for example, uh, criminal versus gentleman, then corruption versus refinement, witch versus fairy godmother, right? All of these shows Dickens' skeptical attitude towards this whole concept of self-improvement, and indeed about progress in a class-ridden, internally divided society. So, uh, though all this industrialization was happening in Britain, though this was a time when people could make money, there were lots of complexities within that process. So that is brought out very clearly by Dickens. The branding of criminals as other serves to keep in shade innumerable transactions that go on all the time between the respectable and the criminal world, which happens even today, right? It's not something that stopped happening from Dickens' time. It still happens even today. So that is the world that Dickens is portraying to us. And yeah, that is uh, our whole presentation of uh, Great Expectations. There was actually a video that I wanted you to watch. What is the time? Is it well past 4? Let me check the time. Okay, we're right on time. Would you like to let me see if I can show you that video? Okay, just a hold. You should tell me whether you can hear it. Okay. Can you see this?
It is still no, ma'am.
No, it's still now, but can you see it?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
please.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, okay. I just want to play to you a scene from Great Expectations where Pip is meeting Magwitch for the first time. Okay. Sorry, that's the ad. Can you guys hear it? You can't hear it?
No, we can see it but can't hear it.
Okay. So like because I'm using the earphones, probably I
Probably.
will.
You can share this link on the chat. Maybe we can
Yeah,
see it.
I will. Yeah, okay, let me do that. I will do that. And also, even if you can't hear it, just see, I just want to tell you, this is Pip is going to the cemetery to place flowers in front of his parents' grave, and Magwitch suddenly jumps out at him. Okay, I will share the link also, but just a few more minutes. Just watch. Just I think 1 minute more. So this is a scene where Magwitch jumps in and scares Pip like out of his skin, and he's chained, and he asks Pip to go and get him, instruments with which to cut his chains. This is the link. I'll just put the link for you guys. Let me stop presenting. Okay, I stopped presenting. Let me just send you the link. It's interesting. You could try watching it. I sent you the link. I hope you guys enjoyed the class. And if you search it, oh, by the way, there is a Hindi version, like a Hindi movie version of this Great Expectations, and Tabu is acting in it. Tabu is acting in it, and Shahid Kapoor is acting in it. Yeah, I think Katrina Kaif is also acting in it. Has anyone watched that?
No,
Okay, just search around. Okay, you may be able to watch the whole movie, but other than that, I mean, the English movie is also there on YouTube. Just search around. You will get links to the whole movie that you can watch, and that will probably help you to understand this more easily. But other than that, I hope the class was helpful, and you guys understood everything that I was saying.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Happy to hear that. So if you have anything to ask me, you can. Otherwise, we can end the class.
Ma'am, just one doubt. Because Magwitch and Molly, actually, he was able to help his own family. Why didn't he help his own family? He helped Pip.
He didn't have a family. I mean, he had, though Estella was his daughter, I don't think they even kept up the relationship.
Actually, Molly was Jagger's
Yes,
servant, right?
yes, yes.
Okay.
Anyone else?
thank you, ma'am.
Pardon? Sri Devi, you said something? I didn't hear.
Ma'am, I said thank you. I'm leaving my family for this.
It's not clear. What did you say?
I said thank you. My son is away. I'm going to him, so I just say thank you to you. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. If
Thank you,
there
ma'am.
is, yeah. So if there's anything more, just let me know. Okay.
Thank you,
Ma'am,
ma'am.
Thank you. You're
Thank you,
welcome,
ma'am.
everyone.
Thank you,
You're
ma'am.
welcome. You're welcome. See you in the next class.
See you, ma'am.
Yes. Bye
See you
bye.
again.
Bye, ma'am. Thank you.
Bye. Um, ma'am, are you there?
Hello.
Hello,
Hello.
ma'am. Next.
Good to see
Uh,
you.
yes, ma'am.
Good to see you,
Ma'am,
Purna.
next. Okay, I'm back again to
Good.
attend your class.
That's great. Good to have you back.
uh, ma'am, next class, which topic, ma'am? Which block?
Yeah, block five.
Block 5.
Block
Okay,
five. That is block five is middle March.
okay, okay.
Middle
Then,
March.
how are you, ma'am?
I'm good. Thank you.
Be healthy, ma'am.
Yes. No. Okay, I'll see you next class. Okay.
Okay, ma'am. Okay,
Okay. I was
bye.
just reading the chat here. There's something
Okay,
that I
okay,
missed. Yeah.
okay.